You're in the right place. And don't forget, you can listen to the full-length, longer version wherever you find your podcasts. Okay, David, thanks so much for coming on. You are in the right place, as it's now called. It's great. It's great to get to chat to you again. We met briefly in Harrogate last year, and we had a bit of a chat there over a beer or two. But why don't you tell us how things are going in your writing world right now, and also give us a sense of where you're speaking from.
Okay. Well, I'll do the second half first.
Yeah.
Despite my accent, I'm from New Zealand originally, but I've lived in the UK 35 years now. But the New Zealandness never quite leaves you, let's
No,
be honest.
absolutely.
So I live in Scotland. I live about sort of 30 miles southwest of Edinburgh. If you can imagine a triangle with Edinburgh at one point and Glasgow at the other, we're sort of at the bottom of the triangle, effectively. Striking distance to both. So that's where I live, and I'm upstairs in my home office, which, as you could see, but obviously not the listeners could see, is just a selection of endless Billy bookcases, all of which are double stacked with research books.
Absolutely.
That's where I am, and where I'm at with my writing. Well, I literally this morning started writing the sixth book in my Cesare Aldo series of historical thrillers set in Renaissance Italy. So I started writing book six at about 5:30 this morning.
Wow.
Yes, I've spent the past 2 weeks waking up stupidly early, which is my brain telling me, my subconscious saying, start writing.
That's
Go
the
on,
same.
start
I'm
writing.
exactly the same. You know, that's always the alarm bells start going off when you start waking up early. It's just that it's so much harder at this time of the year because it's pitch black
Yeah,
and
yeah,
freezing
yeah.
cold.
No, absolutely. I kind of wish I was, sensible like Lee Child, who apparently always starts when he used to write novels, was always start on the 1st of September. I seem to recall reading
Right.
somewhere that was when he would start his new book was 1st of September every year, no matter what day of the week it was. Uh,
Wow.
so I've been procrastinating my way towards the starting line for several weeks now. And you can't see it here, but on the walls around me, I spent yesterday drawing a floor plan of the location where book set six is largely set because I knew I was going to need one. So I
Yeah.
spent yesterday just titivating that up. And I've cast all the main new characters that are introduced in the book. So I've got a lookbook of all the faces of the actors I've cast in the main
That's a
role,
great idea. Yeah.
and just their names, because obviously it's all Italian names and
Yeah.
how they are, and just a couple of lines beneath each of them. Just so if I'm thinking, okay, whose scene is this now? And what will happen is I will get, once I'm sort of 20,000 words into the book, I'll never look at that again. It'll just be wall decoration I won't even notice. But
Yeah.
just to get me started, just so I can look across and go, James Gandolfini is going to be playing Lamberti, the head jailer at the asylum. Good, so I can go right.
And you're in there. You
Early,
go
early
straight there.
menacing figure.
Is
So
it is this the same for you? Is this how you always approach your books now? Obviously, you say this is the sixth one that you write in. Is it always the same, or has that sort of developed over time? You've found this way that kind of works for you in terms of getting organized like this?
I mean, I'm doing this specifically for this book because it's a methodology I used for the second book in the series, which is called The Darkest Sin. And for that, because that was the first one I was writing under contract because it was the second book in the series. So it's the classic thing. You write the first book in the series, you've got your entire life to write the first book in a
Yeah,
series.
yeah.
I mean, I'd written other things before I started writing these, but I'd spent 20 years researching the period and Renaissance Italy and Florence in particular. And then I finally knuckled down to start writing it. But the first book, it still took me 17 months, I think, the first draft around other things, and then another 6 months of working it up from there. Whereas the second book, I was under contract and I had a year to deliver the manuscript. I wanted to deliver the manuscript before the first one came out because
Yeah.
I didn't want that whole thing of the reaction to book one coloring in any way how I wrote book two. Because, it is one of those nightmare scenarios of God forbid you're successful with your first book. The horror. But then you like, oh my God, I would imagine that sort of ratchets the pressure up, and that
Yeah.
you're thinking, oh, how am I ever going to match that?
Yeah. Yeah.
But equally, and or if the first book in a series or a pair, a duology or a trilogy, if it goes wrong, if the critical response to it is not all you hoped it could be, then you're still facing the prospect of having to write the next thing,
Yeah.
more of the
That
same.
was very wise. That was very wise. Are you glad that you did that, presumably?
Yeah, so you always want to, if you can, have book two written before book one comes out, even if they're not a series, even if it's just book two in
Yeah.
the contract, if you can manage it, which isn't
Yeah.
always practical. I know people have got lives and jobs and families and caring responsibilities and all the
Mm.
rest. But if you can manage it, write book two before book one comes out. Of course, the flip side of that is that you're writing in a vacuum. Is that you don't know what response to them, you don't know if it's worked, you don't know what the response to it's going
Yeah.
to be, and you're just
Yeah.
like, hope.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Whatever
so
you do with book two, don't write any more with that character because everybody hates that character. Then book two is completely based on that character.
and you're like going, oh, okay, yay. So yeah, so I mean, there's no easy way around book two. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
But book two was set in book two, Darker Sin is largely set in a convent, and so I had a load of characters who are all nuns.
Yeah.
And the only thing you could see of them is their faces and their hands. And the hands are going to tell you a little bit about, but essentially it was just a load of faces
Yeah.
by wimples and habits and all the rest. And you're like, yeah. So I thought, I'm going to need some help for this. So I went out and found researched a load of photos of nuns, which essentially was half the cast of Call the Midwife. Um, and they're also nice on Call the Midwife. I was really struggling to come up with some nasty nuns. So I had to search beyond Call the Midwife to stack my deck of nuns. And then I just had sort of a lookbook, a bunch of nuns, women dressed as nuns in various states of sternness on the wall for the next 12 months. So whenever I was having to think about who is it? Ah, it's Meryl Streep from Doubt. Quite stern indeed. She would be good as this particular nun. So I found it quite helpful. And also book two, because it was set like it was a kind of closed circle mystery. It wasn't a complete locked room mystery because the corpse is found in the scriptorium of the convent and the door wasn't locked. Because why would they lock it? They're nuns.
Yeah. Yeah.
But nonetheless, the corpse is found in the scriptorium. And I thought, I'm going to need to know where everything is. So eventually, over the course of the year I spent writing the first draft of that, I ended up coming up with a floor plan of the convent because it's a two-story building. And so, in preparation for book six, which as I say, started this morning, I thought, let's make life easy for myself this time. Let's do the floor plan before the book starts so I know exactly where everything is and logic it out. And equally, because it's going to be my character, Cesare Aldo, he's going to go to this asylum, which is up in the hills, and then there's going to be a snowstorm, and he's trapped there for until the snow melts and they can eventually leave. So he's going to be there for several days and then there's going to be murders because it's a crime novel, and he will be investigated. So therefore, it's a closed circle. It's a fixed cast of characters. And I thought, just for the first few thousand words until I get up to speed and the characters emerge and find their own voices and express themselves and become who they are, until I can reach that point, it will be helpful for me if I can look across and go, aha. Kenneth Branagh playing Iago. Yes, he's a bit of a, get about town. Right, I know who that character is. Enough until he becomes his own character on the page. So I've done it once before to this level of detail. And because it's in some ways has some resonances to book two, I mean, it's a very different plot. But nonetheless, it means I think this will be helpful to me. Just in those opening 20, 30,000 words where you're trying to get up to speed, you're trying to establish the house style of the book, you're trying to figure out who my viewpoint characters are and how the story's going to be told and the pacing of it. And because I don't plot completely before I start, as a consequence, a few safety nets are not a bad thing to have when you're doing the high wire act that is a first draft.
Well, that's interesting because obviously, as you say, you write it in essentially mysteries, and it's quite unusual for somebody that writes mysteries to not plot to the absolute nth degree before they start writing.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to have been two schools of thought about this. One is absolutely have your plot, have it all sorted out, and then you can just focus on the prose and the storytelling and the characterization and the dialogue, bringing that all to life on the page. You don't have to worry about the plot. And then there's sort of the other school of thought, which, the likes of Saria Rankin and Val McDermid are much more tell themselves the story and then discover things as they go along.
Mhm.
Like the reader will be discovering things as they go along. And then when you get to the end of a draft, then you go back and go, all right, oh, so they did it. Fine. In
Yeah.
which case I now need to go back and, you know, just gently
Finesse it
layer
and yeah.
in the
Yeah.
clues and the red herrings and what have you that will misdirect the reader enough so when they get to the reveal, it will be hopefully some kind of surprise, or at least make them go, ah, yes, of course. I have the great fortune and the misfortune. My partner, I think, must have been dropped in a vat of Agatha Christie when they were a child, because they have the ability to watch anything or read anything, and literally 20 pages and like, well, they did it
Yeah.
while flicking through
Yeah.
it. Like,
That's
it's
not me.
chapter two.
Yeah.
How can you know?
Yeah.
And like, it's what would happen. I mean, I've over the course of the Aldo series, because I used to write tie-in books. I wrote Doctor Who novels and Judge Dredd, and
Oh
I did
wow.
a Nightmare on
Yeah.
Elm Street
Yeah.
novel and Warhammer Fantasy and all
Yeah.
sorts of things. And for those jobs, and I used to write for TV as well. And for all of those jobs, you had to have a complete synopsis, and you had to submit that up front before you got the contract, before you started writing,
Yeah.
because they were other people's properties. So therefore, you don't go and write a Doctor Who novel unless you're under contract, because
Yeah.
it's never going to be published.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of work like that where I had to do a full synopsis, completely plan the whole thing out in advance, and then if I got contracted, and then I would write the job. And it was great, and it taught me a lot about storytelling and how to do it. Um, and it meant that when the time came to actually draft the story, I didn't have to think about plot because I'd already figured most of it out.
Hmm.
You still have to give yourself freedom to find a better way of telling the story, or to let the better idea influence you, and don't reject the good idea just because it wasn't in your original plot. But uh, I found I could write very quickly because I didn't have to think about plot. So just add dialogue and description, bang, 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 doof. And that was in the days when I was writing 4,000 and 5,000 words a day, 20,000 words a week.
Wow.
Get a full draft of a 80,000 word tie novel. You can knock it off in a month, really.
Yeah.
Lovely, because the
Yeah.
plotting's all done. So you don't have to think as hard. You
Yeah.
just have to throw yourself into it and go with it. And also the characters are pre-created, so there's not that much heavy lifting to be done. You've got some help along the way. Um, so when I started writing the Aldo novels, there's two challenges. One is it's set in real history. So therefore, my goal is to, as much as humanly possible, respect real history and reflect real history. So I follow the calendar of actual events as they occurred. So the first novel in the series, City of Vengeance, is based around a real conspiracy to overthrow the Medici Duke of Florence, which meant I had to make my plot work around real events and the
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
real events within the context of history. So that gives you some shape to the story that you're telling, particularly the first one. The subsequent novels in the series have largely been plots of my own devising. I mean, I still reflect real historical events, but they're less pinpoint to the day, if you will.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I've sort of developed what I call my Wallace and Gromit method of plotting now, which essentially is I'm like Gromit on the train in the wrong trousers, slapping the track down in front of me so the train can
Yeah.
keep moving forwards.
Yeah.
So I will roughly plot out the first act, and then I'll have a go at drafting it, and I'll get to the end of that first roughly 20,000 words, and then I will print it all out. I will go through and just lightly edit it because I'm writing it. Because I work 4 days a week, run creative writing programs at Edinburgh Napier University in Scotland. So as a consequence, I get up at 5:30 in the morning, Tuesday through Friday, if I can, even if it's only a couple of hundred words, just to keep that momentum going. Because if I stop, inertia sets in, and it's so much harder to get started again. I find for me. And then at the weekends, and then on the Monday when I'm not officially teaching, I'll try and get to my word count target for the week, whatever that may be. So I get little bits on Tuesday through Friday. I'll get a bit more on Saturday, more on Sunday, and then Monday usually turns into a good writing day because I've really got the speed back up again. And then I'm teaching again on Tuesday, and all the
It
wind
all
in sails.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I will get to roughly the first 20,000 words, print it out, mark it up, and I make notes. who did what to whom, who knows what, because it's a mystery and they're investigating. So
Yeah.
therefore, what do they know as opposed to what I know in my head about the
Hmm.
characters?
Yeah.
Because I know, well, sometimes I know who did it. Sometimes I deliberately haven't decided who the killer is. I deliberately withhold that from myself so I can do a sort of Midsummer Murders, Death in Paradise reveal at the end, gather everybody in a room and we
Yeah.
define all four suspects, all of whom could have done it, all of whom
Yeah.
were motivated, all of whom had opportunity.
Yeah.
And then we go, da 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 da, it was whoever. Um, so I will do the first 20,000 words and then I will make a note of who knows what, who understands what, and how do they feel about things. And then I use that motivation to plot from a sort of character led way the next chunk of the book, the next act, the next roughly 20,000 words. And then I do some post-its and I'll put down plot points and go, yeah, this could happen, and then this, that could lead to this, and then this. Roughly assemble that into a page and then make bullet points for myself, a rough plan of the next chunk. And then, right, okay, and then you've got enough of a guide to keep yourself going for the next however month roughly that it will take you to write the 20, and rinse and repeat until I get to the end.
So
And
you're
then,
almost splitting it. It's almost like a 5 act structure in a way, and you're kind of splitting it down, and you're kind of taking a pause at the end of each act and going, right,
yeah,
where am I going for the next one? It's
yeah,
really interesting because something that's kind of come out in recent conversations on here, and I got talking to a recent guest, Zoe Lee, about it. Was I'm I'm kind of, I would say I'm a plantser. I'm not a plotter, an out and out plotter, and I have had times when I just completely go by the seat of my pants. But I sort of have to know a little bit kind of where I'm going. And what I said I'm going to try for this next book that I'm about to start writing is to write, because what I find I can't just completely plot the book to the nth degree before I start. I just can't. It never ends up being like the thing. I find I don't know the characters well enough yet, and I haven't decided. You talked about it there, talking about who your POV characters are, say for example, because you think you know who they are, and then you start writing them, and actually I don't need that person to be a POV character, or actually it should be this person or whatever. So I suggested to this my plan is for the next, and it's kind of similar to what you've said, but I was thinking, well, the maximum I can write before I stop. So I'm going to just start writing. I've got my idea, a premise, and a rough idea of where I'm going. I'm not going to allow myself to go past 10,000 words. Then I'm going to take stock. And the big thing for me is I need to know the end, because that's what I've discovered is the problem for me, because I just go off in just too many different directions and often find myself in a cul-de-sac like, well, I don't know why I've gone into this area. I'm taking the plots because somewhere completely different or whatever. Now, whether it works or not, I'll have to report back.
well,
But
it's
I'm
one of the,
trying something different because
yeah, it's one of those suck it and see things, really. You
yeah,
have to keep, I
yeah,
mean, each book, all it teaches you is how to write that book, which is the frustrating thing.
you're
You get to the
right.
end of the book, and go, oh, that's how I write that book, and then you go and
You're
set it
totally
up
right.
to the version of itself it should be.
Yeah,
Um, but and then you have to start again. And I was literally sitting there this morning going, opening sentence is
yeah,
gonna be what
yeah,
now?
yeah,
Trying to, and just have to go. It doesn't matter what the you're going to be rewriting this later anyway. Just stop being precious. Stop trying to write the
yeah,
perfect first draft. You
yeah.
fool.
I know, and especially the opening scene, because it might not even be the opening scene. Often isn't, is it? It's
Mm,
you often find, you've started the book too early or whatever, and you
mm,
often can come in a bit later than you think. But as you say, it's difficult when you first start to just get out of your own way, isn't it? Really, it's just
yeah.
get it down and just remember that you can rewrite it. What's interesting is obviously, as you say, you teach creative writing and you've got all this stuff in your head about structure and acts and everything else, but it sounds like, and I think this about story structure myself, because I do a lot of stuff with story structure and talk to people about story structure, and like you, I've read all the books and everything else. But you find a lot of the time it's one of those things. It seems to be you either know how to do it or you don't. A lot of it is instinctive, and a lot of this stuff we almost map it on afterwards, even
Mm,
if it's even if I mean, I think that's why the structural edit is so important, isn't it? Because you've written the book, and often when you go back on the first draft, you're like, well, something isn't quite right, and let's look at where it is. And that's when you can really think about, well, let's look at the structure. Oh, that's why, because like you say, you've got your big midpoint twist or whatever, but it's not actually in the middle, or it's not where it needs to be, or it's a little bit too early, or it's a little bit too late. That's when that kind of stuff becomes useful, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's so much easier when you're looking at somebody else's structure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because you can just
totally.
step back and go, "Oh, mate, sorry,
Oh, mate, you've done that
this
wrong,
is all
mate.
just falling down here.
Yeah.
That bit where you think is the midpoint, that's the end of Act One. You're going to need a lot more plot here, mate. I'm sorry. Some
It's a bit
cowboy's
like a
done this
builder.
job,
Yeah, I was going to
honestly.
say, it's like a builder coming in and giving you a quote. Oh, who's put this up? Oh, this is a
Oh,
terrible
dear,
job.
oh dear, who put this up? Honestly, that's never going to sustain a narrative for 80,000 words. You're joking. You're having a laugh. Well, yeah, so that you become the story doctor really is like the story builder who turns up and goes,
Yeah,
cowboys.
you don't want to do it like that, mate.
Yeah, no. Oh, what were you thinking? So it's so much easier to see that in somebody else's, and also to deliver those pithy bon mots. Yeah, sorry, your midpoint is the end of Act One. You're gonna need more story. Um, and it's just like, oh, where if somebody said that to me, I'd be like, oh God. I have had people say that to me in the
Yeah,
past, or when I was doing a lot of screenwriting, and they go, yeah, but this point here, start there and then ramp it up.
yeah. You're like,
I once wrote a trilogy of novels based on an old 2008 comic strip called Fiends of the Eastern Front, which is basically World War II with vampires.
yeah,
Um, and the end of the trilogy I wrote, the big finish was in Transylvania, so the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, which is disputed territory between Russia and Germany during the Second World War, and changed hands several times. Anyway, in the book, it concluded with a sequence whereby there is a lake of human blood in which a gigantic vampire bat, like the size of a 747, is sleeping in the lake of blood. And then it rises up at the end of the book, and the good guys kill it by flying a V2 rocket, which they put a silver nose cone on the front to pierce its
nice.
heart and fly that into one of them dies in a sort of Doctor Strangelove style.
Yeah,
Dies, sacrifices himself, flying the V2 rocket through the heart, piercing the heart of the vampire, giant vampire bat in the sky, as you do. And that was how they killed the last of the vampires in the book. And then, so my editor, my publisher on that, he moved to another publisher and he's going, okay. And he said, oh, we'd love if you could come and write for us. I said, oh, that sounds good. I've got this idea. He said, great. Now you remember that bit with the giant vampire bat and the V2 rocket and the lake of blood? I said, yes. The big finish of a trilogy. He said, yes. We want you to start at that level and then fill it up. And I went, mate, I'm not sure I've got that much
I
intensity in
was
me.
gonna say
Maybe a
it's
younger man could do
it's
this, but
pretty intense. Plus, you've got to ditch all that other stuff. So that's yeah,
yes.
pretty
So
pretty
anyway,
horrible.
but yeah, so like you, I like to have I need to know where it's much like the V2 rocket in the heart of the go. I need to
Yeah,
know where the story's heading. What's the end point? What's the conclusion that it's going to come to? That's going to then go, ah. And then in the Elder books, I've stolen a trick that well, trick's a bit harsh, but a thing that Mick Herron does at the end of his Slow Horses novels is often you'll get to the end of the main plot and all the shenanigans with the spies has all been resolved, and then there'll be some small twist in the tale, which is very often character led, which just sets up something that he may or may not explore in the next book.
yeah,
So I've gotten to the
yeah.
habit of get to the
I
end of
like
the
that.
actual story and then have a coda at the end, which is very much character based, and it's a reversal or a development for the character. So the most recent Aldo novel, A Divine Fury, which came out in paperback a couple of weeks ago, the story finishes, and then the last chapter is a reveal about somebody does something, which means nothing will ever be the same again for subsequent books in the series. And I went, oh yeah, that's going to be great. And then I built up a bit of misdirection. So you think it's one person's going to do another thing, and then somebody else does something. You go,
Oh,
oh, I
brilliant.
wasn't expecting that. And then the book I've got coming out in June, Carnival of Lies, which is the one where they go to Venice and come back. He finally gets back to Venice and from Venice to Florence, and then somebody drops a bombshell on literally the last page of the book, and you go, no, come back in a year, people,
And
and
you,
yeah. So
and
so
then you're
I
up again.
I do quite enjoy that last sort of twisted the knife.
Yeah, that's great. That's what it's all about. Well, why don't you tell us about your most recent release, Divine Fury, and give us a bit more background? You've kind of mentioned him in passing a few times, but Cesare Aldo, is that right? Am I
Yeah,
pronouncing that
Cesare
correctly?
Aldo. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the first, yeah, as the series begins and continues, Cesare Aldo. So he's based in Renaissance Florence. So it's the 1530s. The Medici are in charge of the city, and he is an investigating officer for the city's most feared and powerful criminal court, the Otto. They called the Eight because it's sort of eight magistrates who decide the justice and things. So he enforces the law and investigates crimes, largely murders, and the sort of the puzzles other people can't pull apart. Aldo can. And when we meet him he's in his late 30s. He's the illegitimate son of a rich merchant. And so he was brought up as part of the family by his father, who was called Aldo, and his evil stepmother, Lucrezia. And then when his father died, Aldo was about 12. The body was not cold when his evil stepmother just kicked Aldo out of the place and said, "That's it, you're gone, you're out of here. I suffered you for 12 years, get out." And then he survived on the streets from the age of 12 onwards, which is not easy in Florence. And then he became a mercenary. So he was a man at arms. They didn't have standing armies in the Italian peninsula at this point in history. If you wanted to fight somebody, you had to hire a bunch of guys to go and do your fighting for you.
Mhm.
So he was a mercenary for, I don't know, probably 8, 10 years. And then really crocked his left knee, something chronic, and so went, well, I think the mercenary life is maybe right, and horses are maybe not my first choice. So he returned to his beloved Florence and became a constable for the Otto, and then became an officer for the Otto investigating crimes. So that's sort of his job and his backstory. But the Cesare Aldo is a gay man at a time and place in history where that is illegal. It's against the law. It's punishable potentially by, I mean, if you're rich and you could buy your way out of it, you just paid a big fine or imprisonment. And in some cases, gay men were hung from the gates of the prison. Their bodies were set on fire while they were still hanging from the rope. And then their ashes were thrown into the River Arno, so they couldn't get a Christian burial because they didn't deserve it in the eyes of the law or the city. So Aldo enforces the laws, and yet at the same time, his sexuality means he's a criminal. So he's always on the wrong side of the law while trying to enforce the law. So book 4 in the series is called A Divine Fury, and it opens with Aldo has been stuck on night patrol. He was in exile in the Tuscan countryside in the previous book, Ritual of Fire. He's returned now. 17 months have passed, and he spent that entire time on night patrol, which is the most hated job that anybody can. He's been demoted to constable, and yeah, because they have curfew. So basically, he just wanders around the city at night, catching drunks and telling them off effectively. And the only people that are out late at night are drunks and the dangerous and the deranged, effectively. So he's he sees somebody being furtive at night after curfew, so he's sort of stalking him through the city. And then while he's pursuing him, he discovers a body lying on the ground next to Michelangelo's statue of David, the original version of it, before it got moved into the Accademia. And the body it's a dead man. He's been garroted, but the body's been laid out as if crucified, as if on the cross. So Aldo's like, this looks deliberate and this looks religious. Both of those two things are slightly
It's another mystery for me to solve. Yeah.
Because this body has been laid out for us to find in a public place, and it's been positioned as if it's Christ on the cross. Somebody's sending us a message. So Aldo believes that this murder, if he can solve it, that will get him back to being an investigating officer for the Otto. You can get him off night patrol, he'll stop being a constable, he'll get his job back, all will be right with the world. 24 hours later, the next morning, another body is discovered in another public piazza, again positioned as if crucified. So it's very obvious this is a religiously obsessed killer who's picking men. Then the first two victims seem to bear no resemblance or relation to another. Entirely different people, different ages, different walks of life, everything. So it's a real puzzle. And as Aldo investigates, all the evidence seems to be pointing towards a particular church in the southern quarter of Florence, Oltrarno, called San Felice, the Church of St. Felix, and that's where they do exorcisms. So essentially, Aldo is hunting a serial killer and it may or may not involve exorcists. So yeah, that's a
Lots
divine.
of intrigue going on there and lots
Oh
of
yes.
action with the sounds of it as well. So one of the segments that I do on the show is
It's the book. It's the book that saved my life. Saved my life. Yeah, it's the book. It's the book that saved my life.
and it can be fiction, non-fiction, recent, it's something from your childhood, whatever. But if I said that to you, what kind of springs to mind and why?
Well, I've been pondering this in advance, knowing that you were going to ask this question, and I have my answer to hand. And did it save my life? It changed my life. So he holds it up for the benefit of the
Yeah.
listeners. I will also describe
And
it.
the YouTube, yeah. Somebody will see it on YouTube. So yeah.
Well, there
So
we
tell
go.
us, yeah, tell us, yeah.
So it's called Criminal Justice and Crime in Late Renaissance Florence, 1537 to 1609, and it's by a man called John K. Brackett. Essentially, it's the monograph of, I think, of his PhD. So this guy did a ton of research into the criminal justice system in late Renaissance Florence. And he looked through all the court records and translated them all and all the rest. And it's just, I mean, not that you'd be able to see it on the podcast, but for the YouTube readers, they'll be able to see that
It's
the
well
level of
thought up.
highlighting that has
Yeah.
gone on in this book. Every page has got
Yeah.
underlining or highlighting.
Yeah.
Where so in the late 90s, I was working in London. I was a comics editor on 2000 AD, which is iconic science fiction and fantasy weekly anthology comic that anybody who's worked in comics out of Britain in the past 50 years has either got their start or has worked at 2000 AD. So I was editing that in the late 90s. Friday afternoons, I used to walk down to we were in Bloomsbury. I walked towards Tottenham Court Road. I would pass the British Museum. I go into Gosh Comics, who used to be opposite the British Museum before they moved to Soho. And then I would go into all the bookshops in that area. And there was a remainder bookshop around the corner. And I wandered in, and they had this on a stack for like a quid or something, probably, because it's the late 90s. And it was a remainder book. It wasn't selling, unsurprisingly, because, yeah, it's a real barn burner. But I picked it up and I opened it up at a page, and it said, the criminal justice system in late Renaissance France was roughly comparable to a modern police force. And I just went, oh, I could do a kind of police procedural, but in Renaissance Italy. Why has nobody done this? I
Yeah.
quickly then rushed to the nearest bookshop to see, had somebody already done this? No. I thought, I am the man. And then, of course, I realized I knew nothing about Renaissance Florence whatsoever. I hadn't studied the Renaissance. I hadn't studied Florence. I couldn't speak Italian. I'd never even been to Florence at this point in my life. I just watched the film version of A Room with a View, which is set in Florence in the 19th century. And my grandmother was called Florence, and I liked Florence and the Magic Roundabout. But none of those really qualified me to write a historical thriller series set in Renaissance Italy. But anyway, so this book was the start of the Aldo series. So that was, I think, somewhere around 97 at a guess. And that started me on the 20 years of research that led to me writing my series of Cesare Aldo novels. So that was this, it all starts with this book.
I love it.
Book that just that moment I walked into that shop, my eye stuck on the title. I picked it up and I looked at it, fell open and read this page.
What do you think actually attracted you to picking it up in the first place? Because, you know, no disrespect to the
John K.
author or
Brackett,
subject.
emeritus professor. He's retired now. I think he's in America. But yeah, no, it's not like the obvious thing. I wasn't planning to write historical fiction. I knew such, you know, at that point, what was I writing? 97. I think I'd just written my first Doctor Who novel, and I was editing comics, and yeah, I was very busy. I don't know. I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, I've always read crime or mystery stories and thrillers and adventures. So, you know, Famous Five. I always want to call it Hardy During the Nancy Boys, but of course that's the other way around. It's a series I would watch. And about, you know, a teenage lesbian and her two gay friends and so on.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
I would say that, but there is actually a two book series by a New Zealand writer. And it's called The Nancys, and then the Nancys do something else in book two, and it's about two gay guys and they solve crimes with their 11-year-old niece. And they're brilliant. I highly recommend R.W.R. McDonald and the Nancys. You can get it on Audible. It's great. Anyway, yeah, so I always read mysteries and thrillers and things like that. And so I spent a lot of time writing other things. So I wrote Judge Dredd, but he's a policeman of the future. Even when I was writing for Doctors, which ostensibly is a medical drama series, there was always a mystery at the heart of any of the stories that I wrote. So I was always writing crime. It was just never called crime. It was always called something else.
Yeah.
Even when I wrote my Warhammer fantasy novels, it was basically Hill Street Blues or The Bill with the occasional elf wandering past in the background. To the frustration of my publisher, who told me, "Stop calling it a police procedural, it's Warhammer." I'm like, yeah, but is it though? Um, so I always wanted to write crime, and I just didn't have the courage to do it. And then this book sort of said to me, "You could do this. Nobody's done this. Do that." But it still took me years and years to get the courage and to think I was a good enough writer to do the idea justice. I think was the other thing that was holding me back for a long time.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, I could literally talk to you for another hour. We're running out of time, but and I think you should probably come back on for when Carnival of Lies, isn't it? That's coming
Carnival of
out
Lies,
in
June
June. So
26th. Yeah,
I
that's
think
right.
I think we should get you back on nearer that, and we can have another chat and cover off all these other things. But as soon as you mentioned there specifically about self-doubt and how it kind of you had to kind of build up to what you eventually ended up doing. Although what's great is obviously all the way through that you were still writing other stuff, whether it was, as you said, Doctor Who or Doctors or 2000 AD and all that other stuff that you're doing. You were still writing the whole time. But how did you deal with that self-doubt and that? What kind of made you get over it in the end, or what, at what point did you think, hang on, no, I can do this, or at least I can try it? Was there a moment where, was it a bit of validation, external validation that you got from somewhere? How did that come about?
Well, I think one thing I do remember is the John Wagner and Alan Grant, who were sort of two of the biggest writers on 2000 AD. In the early 90s, there was a Robert McKee, story structure guru, had a moment, and he used to come over to London and he would do his weekend long story workshop.
Yeah,
He would stand up and pontificate and do his best Jeff Tracy from the Thunderbirds impersonation. Shaking his little, sugar substitute before pouring it into his coffee, and then you do the whole thing for the whole weekend, and then he would sing as time goes by, before you then all marched out and shook his hand and felt like you should kiss the ring of the Pope of story structure. He was that revered in the early 90s. He became a god for a while. And then, Brian Cox played him in the film of adaptation with Meryl Streep and Nicolas Cage. That's how famous he was. Spike Jones. Or was it Charlie Kaufman? One of the two. Anyway, and so the two Wagner and Grant had heard about this, so they went to his story structure workshop, and they came away from it, and they were going, well, like 80 to 90% of it was just sort of saying what we'd already figured out through 30 years of trial and error of writing comics. He's validated. But there was some stuff that was useful in it. There's one particular thing that McKee would talk about called the controlling idea. And they found, John in particular said, oh yeah, that really crystallized his own thinking and helped pull it together. So I campaigned long and hard for the publishers of 2000 AD, or Judge Dredd I was working on then, to send me on the McKee story structure weekend, because I thought, well, it'd be really helpful. I mean, John very kindly and slightly illicitly gave me his notes from it, or a copy of his notes from it. But I persuaded the company to pay for me to go for the weekend, and I went there, and one of the Mitchell brothers from EastEnders was there with his girlfriend at the time, but there was nobody else famous. But every time you went, there was somebody famous would be in the room. All I got was one of the Mitchell brothers from EastEnders, Ian McFadden, that's who it was. Grant, Phil, whichever one he is.
Yeah.
And and then so went through the whole weekend, and McKee did his shtick. And it was before he published Story, so frankly, you could just buy Story, and you've got the workshop in your hands.
Yeah.
But I went along, and a lot of it was just sort of telling me things I already knew, going, oh yeah, and that's why this works, and I can see how this connects to that. So it really helped to just, it was a lot of validation. If even at that point, I think that would have been 93, 94, I'd be writing comics. I think I'd written my first two Judge Dredd novels, or my first two or three Judge Dredd novels. But then when I wrote my first Doctor Who novel, the McKee's approach to storytelling and structure really helped to give me a shape for that, because otherwise it's called Who Killed Kennedy, and it would have been really baggy and all over the shop without that. So it just helped to sort of stiffen my thinking and give me the scaffolding and the carpentry in order to hold story up, and then the rest is on you. story structure will get you to turning points and all the rest, but whether or not you can write's another matter, and that you have to prove on a sentence by sentence, page by page, chapter by chapter basis. So, yeah, I mean, if you get something published, if you get a commission, you go, all right, okay, I'm kosher. Somebody else has said I'm kosher, and you do that often enough, then you go, right, well, I kind of must know what I'm doing, otherwise these people are fools.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I have learned is how to write. When I was writing for doctors, learned how to write a really good synopsis. So good a synopsis that it would mask the fact that the actual story idea was a bit crap. Um, and my last episode I wrote for doctors, I wrote my synopsis and it went, and it was a year before the producer got to it, to the bottom of the pile, read it, went, oh yeah, we'll do this one. And I went, great, okay, when my script editor told me. And then I printed it out and read it. I went, this is terrible. There's no story here. This is why? Why have they commissioned this? Is
But they bought
dreadful.
it because, yeah.
And I just went, oh no. And I knew I'd sold them a pup on the basis I'd made it seem so much better than it was. But there was no disguising the fact that it was polishing a turd. All the glitter on the outside, but once you get inside,
just
it's
roll it in glitter.
still the same product that you've got. All the shiny in the world is not going to disguise something that wasn't very good, alas. And yeah, that episode, I shudder just to think about it. I knew I was on a loser. I thought I did some good stuff in it, and then the guy who directed it took out all the things I liked and just kept the bad. And I was just like, good to know.
So, final question before we kind of wrap things up. What would you say has been your sort of the thing that resonates with you most? If I said, what's your best piece of creative advice or writing advice that you've been given along the way? Something that somebody said to you at some point and you thought, yes, you held on to that, and it's maybe something that you still carry with you now. I know there's probably lots, but what sort of immediately springs to mind?
Oh, that's a good question there. I find it a lot easier to think of the terrible advice I've been given. Like nonsense like write what you know, which is such bobbins, honestly. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't killed anybody, and yet, not in real life, but the pile of corpses behind me and on the page is nothing to say.
Write what you want to know, I think, is a better way of saying that.
I think write what you know hurts. Write from a position of lived emotional pain and experience, and then infuse that into your characters, and that's going to be slightly more credible rather than, I don't know, 22-year-olds trying to write the pain of a 59-year-old. It's like, really?
Yeah.
You understand what that's like.
Yeah.
So, yeah, whereas anybody can understand what it's like to be in love with somebody, to be in lust with somebody, to be obsessed or besotted with somebody, to be bewildered. So we've all had some version of that. We all know what it's like to be rejected and to feel belittled. So we can write what we know hurts, and we can put that pain into characters and know how they feel and have that empathy for our characters, and then hopefully that will transmit to readers. Yeah, great piece of advice. I'm struggling to come up with one thing in particular, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I do think the John York book Into the Woods has got lots of really useful things, and I think for me it's the best crystallization of at one point I had 100 how-to books about screenwriting and story structure on my shelves, and of all of them, the John York book is like the crystallization of pretty much most of them all brought together in one place. And he, aside from his obsession with 5-act structure, he's not trying to sell you a series of workshops or an ongoing something or other. He's just giving you the benefit of 30 years of experience in storytelling. But I think it's that midpoint pivot, that moment where your character stops pursuing the thing that they want and instead has that moment of realization. Oh, this is what I need in order to be happy or complete or less broken, as the case may be. And then the second half of the story is about them trying to fulfill that need in one form or another. Whether or not they manage that, whether or not they get what they wanted, but not what they need, the ironic ending, will tell you a lot about them. I guess the other thing is probably there's a very short essay by Ursula Le Guin, and she talks about, I think it's in Steering the Craft, which is her craft book, but she talks about you don't need conflict for storytelling. You need change. unless your story's about the fact that nothing ever changes and you're doing 24 hours by After Hours, 24 hours by, well, Martin Scorsese. It's like a late 80s film. Anyway, that aside, unless you're going metafictional.
After Hours, yeah, I've seen. Yeah.
After Hours, that's it. Yeah, with Griffin Dunn. It's really good. So yeah, it's like Gwen says, all you really need to know to tell a story is you need a trajectory. So you need a direction, and then you need some momentum. And that momentum is caused by or brought about by things changing, characters changing, situations changing. So if you can get change in trajectory, so you know where you're headed roughly, and then things are going to change. The character is going to change, or they're going to change the other characters they meet. So if they're an agent of change rather than your classical change protagonist who goes on a journey and sings their "I Want" song in minute 11 of the Disney album, and all these other cliches of structure. Yeah, that. And I think the other thing is about tone. Just as you say, you want to know the ending, have a sense of what the ending's going to be. But I think what you actually want to know is how the ending's going to feel.
Mm.
What is it going to feel like? Is it going to be uplifted? Is it going to be feel good? Is it going to be a character who couldn't change and is therefore destroyed because they are a tragic character? Because the inability to change equals tragedy in most storytelling, I would suggest.
Yeah.
Unless you're Clint Eastwood and then you're an agent of change character and you cannot be destroyed. You will be a ghost or whatever, but you'll keep coming back. Sorry, long babbling answer, even for
No, I love it. So just remind people where they can find out about Divine Fury, which is your latest release, and also where they can find out more about you online and grab your socials and all the rest of it.
Oh, okay. Divine Fury is available pretty much everywhere now in audiobook, ebook, paperback, in the UK, trade paperback in Ireland and Australia and New Zealand. That's finally arrived in Australia and New Zealand, and audiobook and ebook across North America. So yeah, that's out now and available. In order to find me, I have an author website, dvbishop.com. And I have a free author newsletter. It comes out once a week, and that's on Substack, dvbishop.substack.com, I guess. And I'm on Blue Sky, where I'm at dvbishop.com is my Blue Sky handle, and I'm at Cesare Aldo on Instagram. And I've given up on pretty much all the other socials because Nazis.
I know, it's an absolute goddamn nightmare. Okay, well, it's been great to talk to you, David. And like I say, definitely come back on for Carnival of Lies later in the year, because there's so many other things I'd like to ask you about based on what we chatted today. But for now, thanks for being in the right place.
Thank you very much for having me.
And don't forget, you can listen to the full-length, longer version wherever you find your podcasts.